I first noticed it in the way I started apologizing before anyone looked upset. Not for mistakes, for pauses. For questions. For existing in the wrong rhythm. Sorry, I'm just thinking. Sorry, that might sound stupid. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. No one had asked me to say it. But every time I did, the conversation felt smoother. Lighter. As if I'd removed a potential problem before it had time to appear. He never told me to apologize. He just reacted differently when I did. When I softened my presence, his attention sharpened. When I hesitated and added an apology, he listened more closely. And without realizing it, I began using that word as a key. Not to open doors. To prevent them from closing. He had a way of pointing out tension without naming it. If I spoke too directly, he'd tilt his head slightly and say, "You sound sure." Not accusing. Observing. If I disagreed, he'd smile faintly and reply, "You don't have to defend yourself." I wasn't defending myself. But after that, I started. I began adding explanations where none were needed. Softening opinions. Framing everything as a question, just in case certainty felt threatening. One evening, I said, "I think you're wrong," and immediately added, "Sorry, I mean, maybe I'm missing something." He nodded approvingly. "That's more accurate," he said. I didn't know what he meant. But I learned the lesson anyway. The first time I apologized for something I hadn't done, it didn't feel strange. He had been quiet. Distant. Thoughtful. I asked if everything was okay. "Of course," he said. And without knowing why, I replied, "I'm sorry if I did something wrong." The words left my mouth before I'd found the thought behind them. He looked at me for a moment, then said gently, "You didn't." Relief washed through me. And then something subtler. Gratitude. Not because I'd been forgiven. Because I'd been reassured. That I was still safe. Later that night, alone, I tried to remember what I'd been apologizing for. I couldn't. And that was when the question finally appeared, soft but impossible to ignore. When did "I'm sorry" stop meaning regret? And start meaning, "Please don't be upset with me"? The first time I apologized in my head, I didn't notice it. I replayed a conversation from earlier that day, a moment where I'd spoken too quickly, too directly. Nothing bad had happened. No one had reacted. And yet, in the silence of my thoughts, I heard myself say it. Sorry. Not to him. To an imagined version of him who might have been disappointed. The word felt automatic. Necessary. I rewound the moment and tried to replay it differently, softer, slower, with more caution. The discomfort eased. That was when I realized something strange. I wasn't remembering conversations anymore. I was correcting them. After that, apologies started appearing everywhere. Before thoughts. Before decisions. Before feelings. If I wanted something, I first apologized for wanting it. If I felt hurt, I apologized for feeling sensitive. If I disagreed, I apologized before the disagreement had even formed. Sometimes I caught myself whispering it without sound. Sorry for thinking this. Sorry for noticing that. Sorry for wanting more. No one could hear me. But I said it anyway. And slowly, without noticing, I began to believe something I had never consciously decided. That every impulse needed forgiveness. Before it was allowed to exist. The moment it frightened me came late one night. I was lying in bed, thinking about something I wanted to say to him the next day. Not an accusation. Not a complaint. Just a request. And before I reached the end of the sentence in my head, the apology appeared. Not after. Before. Sorry to bother you, but... I froze. Because I realized I hadn't even decided what I wanted yet. And I was already asking for permission to want it. That was the first time the question felt unavoidable. If I apologize before I speak, before I think, before I feel, at what point does sorry stop being a word and become the way I exist? The first time he accepted an apology he didn't understand, it happened quietly. I said sorry out of habit, for interrupting, I thought, or maybe for taking too long to answer. I wasn't even sure. He paused. Sorry for what? He asked. I opened my mouth to explain. Nothing came. I searched my mind for the mistake, the misstep, the thing I was supposed to regret. There was nothing. I don't know, I said finally. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, he said. I accept it. The relief was immediate. And then something inside me shifted. Because he hadn't forgiven a mistake. He had forgiven me. After that, it started happening more often. I apologized without knowing why. He accepted without asking for what. Sometimes he even thanked me. For noticing, he'd say. For being considerate. For taking responsibility. Responsibility for what, I never quite knew. But each time, the same feeling followed, safety. As if the apology had restored balance. As if something fragile had been repaired before it could break. One evening, I said sorry 3 times in one conversation. He smiled gently and said, "You're very aware of yourself." It sounded like praise. And I realized something that made my stomach tighten. He was no longer reacting to my apologies. He was starting to expect them. The moment I understood this wasn't accidental came when I didn't apologize. We disagreed about something small. Nothing serious. A preference. A plan. I stated my opinion and stopped. No sorry. No softening. No retreat. The silence that followed was different. Not angry. Observant. He looked at me as if he were waiting for something. I felt it immediately, the pressure in my chest, the urge rising fast and familiar. Say it. Fix it. Restore the rhythm. When I didn't, he finally spoke. That's okay, he said slowly. You don't have to apologize every time. Relief rushed through me. And then, beneath it, something colder. Why had I been so certain that he had been waiting for me to? The first time I apologized for how he felt, it slipped out before I understood what I was doing. He had a long day. Quiet. Distant. Nothing I had caused. We were sitting together when I said, softly, "I'm sorry you're stressed." He looked at me, surprised. "I'm not upset with you," he said. "I know," I replied quickly. Sorry anyway." The words landed strangely between us. Later, alone, I tried to trace the logic. Why was I apologizing for something that hadn't involved me? And the answer came too easily. Because if his mood improved after that, it would mean I'd helped fix it. After that, I began doing it without noticing. If he sounded tired, I apologized for talking too much. If he was quiet, I apologized for distracting him. If he seemed distracted, I apologized for needing attention. I started mapping his emotions automatically. Not to understand them. To take responsibility for them. Sometimes he corrected me. "You didn't do anything," he'd say. But he never told me to stop. And slowly, something dangerous formed in my head. If he feels better after I apologize, maybe I really was the problem. The moment it crossed a line came one evening when he was upset about something unrelated. Work. Family. Something I knew nothing about. He paced the room, tense and silent. I watched him, heart racing, searching my memory for the mistake I must have made. Finally, I whispered, "I'm sorry." He stopped. Turned to me. "For what?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. I hate that you're upset." He studied me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You always try to carry things that aren't yours." It sounded kind. Almost protective. But later that night, lying awake, I realized something that made my breath catch. I wasn't apologizing to comfort him. I was apologizing so his emotions wouldn't be my fault. The guilt started arriving before anything happened. Not after mistakes. Before moments. Before words. Before choices. Before silence. If I felt the urge to speak, guilt appeared first, warning me that what I was about to say might disturb something fragile I couldn't see. Sometimes I apologized in advance. "Sorry, this might be dumb. Sorry, this might not matter. Sorry, I don't mean to bring this up." Even when nothing followed. And slowly, I began to understand something frightening. Guilt was no longer a reaction. It was a signal. A quiet instruction telling me which parts of myself were dangerous. I started scanning the future the way I used to scan the past. Imagining moments before they happened. Not to plan. To locate where I would later feel responsible. If I wanted to go somewhere, I imagined him being tired afterward. If I wanted to say something, I imagined him misunderstanding it. If I wanted attention, I imagined him feeling pressured. And then the guilt arrived. Preemptive. Efficient. Sometimes I canceled plans I hadn't made yet. Sometimes I apologized for conversations that had never occurred. Once, I caught myself thinking, "I'm sorry," about a feeling I hadn't even allowed to exist. That was when I realized something devastating. I had started punishing myself for futures that hadn't happened. The moment I understood how deep this went came in the smallest possible way. He smiled at me one afternoon and said, "You seem quiet today." Nothing else. No accusation. No concern. Just an observation. And suddenly, my chest tightened. I searched desperately for the reason I must be quiet. The fault I must have committed. The tension I must have caused. "I'm sorry," I said automatically. He blinked. "For what?" I froze. Because I realized something that made my hands shake. I wasn't apologizing for anything he'd done or felt. I was apologizing because I was afraid that simply being myself might eventually become a problem. I started trying to become a safe person. Not in the obvious ways. Not kinder. Not quieter. Safer in advance. I edited my moods before he could notice them. Smoothed excitement into calm. Hid disappointment behind neutral language. Learned to look fine even when something inside me wasn't. I stopped bringing problems unless they were already solved. Stopped sharing feelings unless I'd already minimized them. If I was sad, I waited until it passed. If I was angry, I reframed it. If I was hurt, I apologized for being sensitive. I told myself I was being considerate. But late at night, alone, I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't trying not to hurt him. I was trying not to exist in ways that might inconvenience him. The first time I noticed how unnatural this had become was when a friend asked me a simple question. "Are you okay?" I opened my mouth to answer honestly. Nothing came out. Instead, I heard myself say, "Yeah, I'm fine. Sorry, I'm just tired. Sorry for being tired." My friend looked confused. "You don't have to apologize." I smiled. "I know." But inside, something tightened. Because I realized I no longer knew how to be unfiltered. Without immediately asking forgiveness for it. The most frightening part wasn't how much I'd changed. It was how normal it felt. Being careful felt mature. Being low maintenance felt virtuous. Being invisible felt respectful. I began measuring my worth by how little emotional weight I took up. How few needs I expressed. How rarely I disrupted the atmosphere. One evening, he looked at me and said softly, "You're very easy to be with." I smiled, proud. Later, alone, I stared at the ceiling and felt something hollow open inside my chest. Because I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. People don't become easy to be with by becoming better. They become easy to be with by becoming smaller. The first time I allowed myself to be inconvenient, it wasn't planned. I was tired. Not physically, emotionally. Something small had hurt me earlier, and for once, I didn't smooth it away. I didn't reframe it. I didn't wait for it to disappear. When he asked how I was, I said, "Actually, I'm not great." And I stopped. No apology. No explanation. No joke to soften it. The silence that followed felt enormous. Not hostile. Expectant. For a second, panic surged through me, the familiar urge to repair the moment, to take it back, to say I was fine after all. I didn't. He looked at me carefully. Not annoyed. Not distant. Just attentive. "What happened?" he asked. The question startled me more than any reaction could have. I told him. Not everything. Not dramatically. Just the truth. When I finished, my heart was racing, waiting for the shift in his mood. The withdrawal. The tension. The subtle sign that I had crossed a line. None came. He nodded slowly and said, "That makes sense." That was all. No correction. No discomfort. No need for me to disappear. And suddenly, I felt something so unfamiliar it almost scared me. Space. Later that night, alone, the realization hit me harder than the moment itself. Nothing bad had happened. The world hadn't collapsed. He hadn't pulled away. I hadn't become a problem. The only thing that had changed was that I hadn't erased myself first. And in the quiet that followed, another thought appeared, soft, dangerous, undeniable. What if I had been shrinking for a threat that no longer existed? Or worse, what if it had never existed at all? The realization didn't come as anger. It came as grief. Not for what he had done. For what I had practiced. For every moment I'd swallowed a feeling before it reached my voice. For every apology I'd offered for emotions no one had asked me to erase. For every version of myself I'd edited out. Before anyone else had the chance to reject it. He had never told me to be smaller. He had never asked me to be easier. And that truth hurt more than blame ever could. Because it meant the most painful part of this story was something I had done very carefully to myself. I began noticing all the places where I still did it. The reflex apology when I laughed too loudly. The softened opinion. The instinct to make my sadness convenient. Sometimes I caught myself halfway through shrinking. And instead of correcting it, I stopped. I let the sentence finish unpolished. I let the feeling stay unfiltered. I let the moment be slightly uncomfortable. It was terrifying. Not because anyone reacted badly, but because I realized how unfamiliar it felt. To take up the space my emotions naturally occupied. For the first time, I wasn't practicing being safe. I was practicing being real. I don't tell this story because he was cruel. He wasn't. He never punished me for being honest. Never demanded silence. Never asked me to disappear. He simply existed in a way that I admired long enough for me to believe that love meant not being a burden. And the quiet truth I live with now is this. The most dangerous lessons aren't the ones someone teaches you. They're the ones you invent. To survive a love you're afraid might leave. And once you see that, you finally understand where the control truly began. Not in him, but in the moment you decided that being acceptable was more important than being yourself.